Hello, little one. What a peculiar little creature you are. Am I imagining things, or do you share certain features with this caretaker of yours? Is he your daddy by any chance? How curious. How very, very curious, I must admit. I would not mind taking that role myself. In fact, I'd like to be your daddy too.
Pocketcat is one of the most terrifying creatures in the world of fear and hunger. Not simply because he forces us to rethink what makes a monster truly frightening, but because from the very first moment he appears, he also compels us to ask a whole series of questions. What exactly is this creature? Where did he come from? And why does he harbor such a twisted desire toward humanity, especially toward children? In this lore video, we are going to dive deep into the mysterious origins of Pocketcat, starting from the very beginning of it all, moving through the darkness of the dungeon of fear and hunger, and finally arriving at the festival of TERMINA, where the blood-soaked festival beneath the moonlight will reveal the final secret behind his origins, as well as the true horror this mysterious creature leaves in its wake. Long time ago, at the primordial beginning of all things, this world belonged to the old gods. The old gods are primordial entities, existing as the foundational concepts that make up the order of the fear and hunger universe. Each god represents a distinct concept. Some are tied to creation, some to destruction, some to nature. And there are also those who embody the darkness of the abyss, along with disgust. Then, from those very gods, humankind was born. It is said that Sylvian, the goddess of love, lust, and creation, breathed a soul into Vitruvia's drawing, thereby creating men and women at the dawn of time. What is worth noting is that Sylvian commanded Vitruvia to design the form of humanity in her own image. But Vitruvia soon realized that within that drawing, there were already errors, deviations, imperfections. And that is why, from the very first moment, humankind was already a strange species. They were not entirely the children of the gods, yet they were never truly separate from divinity either. Within their flesh, there still remained traces of the sacred, but at the same time, it also contained the remnants of chaos, of ego, and of incompleteness. Sylvian loved her children deeply. But in the end, humanity was unable to return that love in the way she had hoped. In time, they began to stray from the path the gods had laid out for them. At an unspecified point, humanity began to lift its head and look up at the sky, to look upon the very gods who had created them. And then, deep within their minds, a dangerous thought began to take root. Perhaps the distance between man and God was not truly untouchable. Just think about it. If humankind was born from the hands of the gods and bears traces of the sacred, then why should they accept living forever in the position of those who do nothing but bow their heads? The birth of the new gods, and especially All-Mare, the Ascended One, made that desire no longer merely a vague thought. It gradually grew into belief. Then, from belief, it turned into ambition. And from ambition, it became arrogance. And this is where the story truly begins. Humanity's hidden ambition never escaped the eyes of the higher beings. More importantly, among the ranks of the old gods, there was one who saw through the false mask of this species more than any other. Rare, the moon god, the god also known by the title, the all-seeing one in the sky.
Trickster god, also known as the moon god. He is one of the last, older gods to still observe mankind. He is a jealous kind. He would not share the godhood and the world order with humans and the new gods. He has many ploys to diminish our influence.
They said that the moon god had always watched humanity with eyes full of jealousy and malice. His light could pierce through falsehood, looking deep into the hidden desires and base thoughts of human beings. For that, Rare did not love humankind. He did not see in them the beauty of creation, nor did he see in them any hope worth nurturing. All he saw was an artificial, lowly, and arrogant species. A species that trembled before hunger, disease, and death, yet still dared to imagine that one day it could climb the steps to stand alongside the older gods. So, the moon god developed a dark and enduring emotion: jealousy. It seems that the source of this emotion came from the moon god realizing the true potential of humanity. Leonard Cohen once said, "There is a crack in everything," referring to the very crack, the imperfection, as the place where the light can enter, which means that, precisely because of their imperfection, the potential of this species is almost limitless. Limitless in its capacity to ascend, and equally limitless in its capacity to be corrupted. But that is still not the whole story. In my view, the true reason the moon god hates humanity may lie in their very nature: falsehood. The book, The Truth Under the Moonlight, mentions that human beings have a habit of hiding their true nature behind a mask that, in an invisible way, runs contrary to the nature of the moon god, the god always associated with a light that exposes truth in the darkness of night. In a video analyzing Rare, I once mentioned that, in a certain sense, this god may represent the aspect of truth. The light of the moon god has the ability to expose what is hidden, dragging humanity's base desires and true nature out of the darkness they struggle to cover them with. However, for some reason, the truth he shows seems never to be complete. It is as if the moon god is deliberately concealing, teasing, an act of mockery directed at the very nature of the species he envies. And as people often say, half a truth is no truth at all. So perhaps that is precisely why the moon god is misunderstood by human beings and given titles associated with deceit, among them the trickster god. So, what does all of this mean? Just think about it. If the moon god is the god who represents a light that pierces through truth, then in your view, what is it that he hates most? That's right, falsehood. Perhaps it is also because of those two reasons that Rare cloaked himself in the shell of the moon, high above day and night, watching over the species he envied. What's interesting is, if Grogoroth observes humanity from a perspective closer to curiosity, then the moon god observes this species from a perspective closer to surveillance, control, and prevention. A kind of observation with deliberate intent, meant to deny humankind any chance to develop beyond his control. The moon god's suspicion was not without basis. Over time, there began to appear among humanity certain individuals with exceptional potential, seeds that could develop to the point of shaking the standing and influence of the ancient gods in the real world. And that is something he never wanted to happen. So, the moon god came to a decision. If human beings refused to accept their lot and still wished to rise to the station of the old gods, then he would send down something that would both remind them and block every path to the ascension of this lowly species. A creation, a message, that some fledglings will die before they ever take flight. some destinies will be hunted from childhood, and some children carry within themselves limitless potential. But for that very reason, their fate will become a target to be hunted. It is said that one day, while in deep sleep, Rare dreamed up a creature, a strange creature, bearing an appearance that was polite and familiar, yet at the same time uncanny and frightening, in a way that would make anyone who saw it feel both drawn in and unsettled. Pocketcat. They call him a servant of the trickster god. The new gods, when speaking of him, can only say that his motives lie upon the path laid out by the older god, and that even they do not fully understand those mysterious ways. Well, that is understandable. Unlike an ordinary follower, Pocketcat truly is a being born from the power of the moon god. That is why there exists between Pocketcat and his master a connection that humans and ordinary followers cannot possess. Without having to undergo rituals, scriptures, or sacrificial circles to reach the old gods like others do, Pocketcat understands the commands of his master in a way that is almost natural. In particular, that bond becomes even stronger on nights of the full moon, the time when the presence of his master in the sky becomes clearer than ever. As the creation of an old god, Pocketcat's origin is as mysterious as the way his master himself appears. No one knows exactly when he was born, or by what means he is able to appear in the real world. All we know about this mysterious creature is that he was created from the dream of the moon god, then somehow took on a concrete form and appeared in the world of humankind. And that is what makes him so unsettling. Nietzsche once said, "Man is the cruelest animal." That might be why the moon god shaped Pocketcat into a form close enough to human beings to approach them, while at the same time distorted enough to plant in their memory an unnameable feeling of fear and unease. He has the appearance of a tall man, dressed in elegant clothing, with mannerisms and a voice as courteous as a gentleman, standing in total contrast to his grotesque face, as though he were wearing a cat mask, along with the distorted smile always fixed upon his lips. There's something deeply unsettling about him, as if behind that polite mask he is hiding an entirely different face. That makes Pocketcat alluring in an intensely uncomfortable way. It is as if Rare deliberately created this being as a twisted copy, meant to mock the very artificial and ugly nature of humankind. Perhaps, in the eyes of the moon god, humanity gives him a sense of artificiality and discomfort, no different from the way humankind looks at Pocketcat. Although some people see Pocketcat as more of an eccentric, amusing man than a terrifying monster, but let me ask you a question. In your view, what truly creates the terror of a monster? A horrific appearance, supernatural power, or a sense of mystery? Well, to me, it lies in an extremely ordinary detail, yet one that carries far greater weight. Naoki Urasawa, in his work, Monster, portrayed an extremely terrifying monster without needing any bizarre appearance or supernatural power. Johann Liebert is a human being with a perfect appearance. He is handsome, calm, intelligent, polite, and most importantly, he knows how to read people. Johann understands his prey, knows how to touch the fear and emptiness inside them, and from there causes the victim to destroy themselves without him having to act with his own hands. And that is what truly makes him frightening and haunting.
I hope you don't mind if I ask this straight. Living humans are divided into two groups, yes? There are children of light, those destined to walk under the bright sun, Those people do well in all hardships of life. They have dear humans who they want to return to. Even in the darkest hour, they can feel the warmth of their loved ones in their heart and gain extra courage from that. Then, in the opposite end of spectrum, there are people of darkness. Those humans are often driven to depression and sorrow because of life's peculiar ways, but they have learned how to live with those feelings. In fact, they have grown to love the ever-pressing darkness within. Those humans are able to draw energy from darkness. They are not dependent on other people. They only need darkness, their old friend. So, humans of light and darkness, which one are you?
Pocketcat understands the nature of human beings. He even classifies humanity into two groups: the children of light, of happiness and joy, in contrast to the people of darkness, of sorrow and tragedy. The strange thing is, Pocketcat understands the tragedy of those born from darkness to such an extent that it feels as though he himself has once passed through its deepest layers and then accepted living with that darkness as a fate already arranged in advance. There is something about him that makes us feel sympathy, feel closeness, feel that he is more human than many actual human beings. And that is precisely what makes him truly frightening. Think about it. A disgusting monster would only make people afraid and run away immediately. But what would happen if that monster took the form of a proper gentleman, spoke gently, moved with courtesy, and above all, understood the nature of humanity? That, I think, is the real horror. This means that Pocketcat can easily slip in, hide within human society, and from there approach and hunt the prey he truly targets from the very beginning.
It was a rainy day in the countryside, just north from the forest of Merwood. Willem, the wildest child known in the town, would stare at the raindrops behind the window screen. His mother would warn him of going outside. During rain, decent boys would help their parents with various indoors tasks. Rain brings forth all kinds of dangers, not otherwise known to little boys. Disregarding the warnings and without a worry in the world, Willem dashed through the bushes and ran deep into the Merwood forest. In the heart of the forest, all wet from the rain, Willem heard slight panting noises from an overgrown grotto nearby. Cautiously, Willem peeked through the leaves. He would not believe his eyes when he saw a finely dressed cat standing on 2 feet, twice as tall as Willem's father would be. The cat's back was facing Willem. Its hand was moving swiftly inside its pocket, while the 2 big yellow eyes gleamed inside a burlap bag in great excitement. Suddenly, the hand movement came to a halt. Even if Willem was well hidden behind the leaves, slowly, the cat turned its eyes towards him. In terror, Willem ran as fast as he could towards his home. The 2 glowing yellow eyes of the cat haunted him all the way to his home gates. His mother was there to meet him by the front door. "So you just had to go to the woods, did you?" said his mother. "You saw something you shouldn't have, right?" questioned his mother. "And how do I know this?" Willem's mother would go inside to get a little parcel with decorated wrappings. This appeared on the front door just before you came. It was directed to young Mr. Willem. Slowly, Willem unwrapped the decorated paper with small mouse prints on it. Inside the parcel, there was catnip.
The story of Willem is evidence that Pocketcat seems to come from a very distant past, so distant that his very presence entered directly into fairy tales. The kinds of stories adults use to frighten disobedient children, the children who refuse to stay inside when it rains, and who insist on wandering alone in the dark. All of them carry the same motif. A child steps out from their place of safety, then encounters a strange being with a cat's face, an abnormally tall body, walking on 2 legs, dressed like a gentleman, appearing in the deep forest, behind dark bushes, or beneath the full moon. The child runs back in terror, returns home, and then realizes that something strange has appeared right at the doorstep. A catnip, a gift, but at the same time, also a sign that the prey has been marked. From that moment onward, the child's fate is almost already decided. Pocketcat will silently watch the victim, play with the prey's mind, until fear clings tightly to them.
The town of Merwood was in festive mood. It was the beginning of the harvest season, and food was plentiful. Willem's mother and father were arranging a large party for all the big families of the town. Even some noble ones were supposed to show up from outside the town. Willem had to wear his Sunday suit, the suit he would typically wear when going to the church on Sundays. Needless to say, the suit wasn't to Willem's liking. Now, you know we need to make good impressions to the city folk, his mother would say. Why should I care? Said Willem. Willem's mother would pull him by the ear violently and say, Don't you understand? Our livelihood depends on those noble and the fancy. Willem shrugged it off and nodded. It is important to obey your parents after all, if you are to grow up even somewhat decent and moral. It is even written on the book of our Lord, the Bible of Almer. The party guests started coming as the sun set. The festive people were of all kinds. You had the well-eaten mayor of the town with his wife, who was so young. She couldn't have been more than 3 years older than Willem. You had the Parkinsons from the next door, with their faces forever set on an expression of pure disgust. There were also many people Willem had never seen before, especially one gay gentleman with a constant grin on his face, caught Willem's attention. The man also noticed young Willem. He winked his eye, even though otherwise his face was set on the same grin all the time. The gentleman gave Willem jeepers creepers. As the full moon had risen the highest, and the festive people were at their most cocked, Willem noticed the gay gentleman gone. After a short search, he found the man from their backyard, howling at the moon. This already made young Willem very nervous, but then the man turned his gaze towards Willem. His eyes were the same as the 2 haunting yellow eyes Willem had seen in the Merwood forest some days ago. Suddenly, Willem realized the size of the man. For some reason he had not realized it before, but the man was almost the same height as their house. With a cat-like expression, the man would say, "Fancy meeting you here, young mister."
The story is cut off midway. The rest can no longer be read. The ink has been smudged, as if someone deliberately did not want us to continue reading for some reason. The game never says this directly, but perhaps Willem's fate too was ultimately swallowed by darkness, like that of so many other children who had once fallen into Pocketcat's sights. It can be seen that Pocketcat is directly inspired by the bogeyman figure in folklore, but twisted into a far more horrifying version. He kidnaps children, stuffs them into a burlap sack, and waits until their minds are completely drowned in darkness and terror. Only then does he finish off the unfortunate one and devour their body in excitement. At this point, Pocketcat is very close to the figure of the Sackman, or Bagman, a variant of the boogeyman, often told as a large man carrying a sack, specializing in capturing naughty children, stuffing them into the sack and taking them away, sometimes to sell them, sometimes to eat them. But the difference between Pocketcat and the Sackman is that Pocketcat does not exist only in stories. He is a real entity, hunting with very clear will and intent. What makes him even more terrifying is that he can blend into human society, and somehow, almost no one truly notices anything unusual about him, not even the children themselves. Honestly, this detail genuinely gives me chills, because it not only reinforces what we have analyzed before, that Pocketcat understands humanity to the point that he can easily blend into human society, but it also leads us to two very terrifying conclusions. First, it seems that Pocketcat has the ability to alter his face in order to infiltrate the human community and hunt. Or it may also be that, from the very beginning, he already possessed the face of humanity, and the cat face we see is merely a mask, something used to conceal the true nature behind it, or perhaps even the place where Pocketcat's darkest mystery is stored. Keep that in mind, because I will return to it and analyze this detail more carefully in the latter half of the video. Second, the nature of human beings in this dark world has become so ugly that they are no different from monsters. Humanity hides its true nature behind masks, artificial, and remains so fixated on itself that it does not even distinguish or realize that the monster has already infiltrated and exists within its own community.
So, how do you think we should handle the situation now that you've seen something you shouldn't have? We need to have a common secret so that I can truly trust you. Would you like that? Would you love that? Would you love me? What will the others say when they hear what you did also? What happened would bring shame to both of us.
What makes Pocketcat an interesting character to me, mixed with a certain sense of obsession, is that this creature uses a kind of language steeped in grooming, meaning manipulation, guidance, and reversing blame onto the victim themselves. This is a deliberate process in which the abuser approaches the target, builds trust, manipulates the psyche, and gradually gains control over a person, usually children, adolescents, or vulnerable individuals, while also establishing secrecy and silence in order to avoid detection, with the final destination being abuse. Pocketcat understands very well how to create shame. He turns the prey into someone equally at fault, making the victim believe that if they tell the truth, they themselves will also be judged and condemned. That is precisely what allows Pocketcat to silence the victim from within. Pocketcat's vileness lies not only in the fact that he devours the victim's body, it is also embedded through small details, such as how he always keeps one hand thrust deep, rummaging in his trouser pocket when excited, or scratches his crotch when he has acquired prey that particularly delights him. The implication is clear. Pocketcat carries a pathological fascination toward his own victims. It cannot be ruled out that he also commits depraved acts with the victim, or more horrifying still, with the corpse, or with whatever remains of them. Although this makes me nauseous, in the end, in this dark horror universe, any disgusting thing can happen, right? What's even more interesting is Willem once mentioned Pocketcat's sexual inclination. In their encounter at the party, he described him as a gay man, always looking at him with eyes full of interest. Of course, this may only be a subjective impression from the boy. But if we look at the overall way Pocketcat expresses interest toward many subjects of different genders throughout the game, I think it would make more sense to view him as an entity with bisexual tendencies, or at the very least, as a creature that cannot be defined by ordinary gender boundaries because of his very otherness. When all is said and done, no matter how one chooses to look at it, this small detail only further highlights the inherent grotesqueness and abnormality of Pocketcat. The moon god was extremely subtle in creating a being that is not only frightening, but also carries a very distinct depth and allure of its own. He lurks in the forests, in the darkness, and even in the midst of human society, present even in the fairy tales used to warn children. The movements of Pocketcat are therefore always covered by a veil of mystery until he first reveals himself in the dungeon, in a highly deliberate manner, in the year 1590, the time when the main events of Fear and Hunger 1 take place. Fear and Hunger 1 opens against the backdrop of the Kingdom of Rondon, a vast kingdom formed from many tribes and smaller states that once warred with one another before finally uniting under a single banner. On the surface, Rondon is the image of order and power, but behind that mask lies decay, violence, and dark secrets buried deep beneath the foundations that mankind believes it has brought under control. One of Rondon's emblematic structures is the Dungeon of Fear and Hunger. In the beginning, it was a colossal prison used to confine the kingdom's worst criminals. But over time, that prison became notorious for strange rumors. People whispered that the dungeon had been gnawed away by darkness from within. Here, violence and deviant, immoral acts took place as though they were natural. All of it stemmed from a mysterious corpse buried deep below the dungeon, the remains of a dead old god. In the year 1590, Rondon fell into a period of chaos, not only having to face a deadly plague of unknown origin, but also struggling against a strange darkness that was gradually slipping out of control and spreading from the dungeon. Amid all these calamities, a series of mysterious child disappearances continued to occur, causing the atmosphere of the kingdom to grow ever more grim. Obviously, the mysterious disappearance of the children could hardly be unrelated to Pocketcat. Most likely, taking advantage of the strange plague sweeping through the land, Pocketcat had been carrying out one abduction after another to satisfy his animal urges and his hunger. This hypothesis becomes even more plausible when the setting of the Kingdom of Rondon is placed beside its inspiration. Medieval and early modern England, especially in the late 16th century, when Europe lived under the shadow of a horrific plague that claimed tens of thousands of lives, the bubonic plague. From looking into it, I learned that the bubonic plague was caused by a disease-causing bacterium. Rats and many species of rodents are its natural hosts, or reservoirs. Blood-sucking insects are the vectors that transmit the disease from rats to humans. Coincidentally, in the Dungeon of Fear and Hunger, there are many signs pointing to the heavy presence of insects: the cockroach king, scarabs, cave spiders, and many other kinds of bugs in the gauntlet. These creatures seem to be closely connected to the god of the depths, an old god believed to be dead, whose body lies deep at the bottom of the dungeon. God of the Depth has the ability to control insects, and very likely certain rodents as well, such as rats. This detail is reinforced by the fact that later, the god of fear and hunger, the inheritor of the god of the depth's power, also possesses similar abilities. One of them includes the ability to communicate with or control insects, rats, crows, and frogs. Many people think this ability is not especially impressive when placed beside Grogoroth's power of destruction, Sylvian's power of regeneration, or Rare's psychic powers. But what if we've been looking at this the wrong way the whole time? What if I told you that, in truth, the god of the depths, and later the god of fear and hunger, possesses one of the most terrifying powers in this entire world, with a scale and influence far beyond what we imagine? Mischief of rats, a skill that can be learned from the god fear and hunger, is described as follows. Summon a mischief of rats to disrupt the enemy. Rats spread confusion and disease wherever they go. This line suggests that this god can control rats and lowly creatures, and through them spread plague, chaos, calamity, and death, much like what the bubonic plague once wrought in the real world. And if that's true, then this is no minor ability anymore. It is a form of power capable of silently bending the course of history itself. Perhaps this is also the very way this god later pushed humanity forward, not through enlightenment, but through plague, fear, and the pressure of survival. The fact that the god of the depths has the ability to control insects and rats to spread disease leads us to one conclusion. The mysterious plague ravaging Rondon most likely originated from the god of the depths, or more precisely, from this god's dead body. It may be that those tiny creatures gnawed upon the corpse of the god of the depths until the darkness and disgust from that rotting body seeped into them. From there, much like the plague, they spread outward, carrying disease and infecting the inhabitants of nearby lands, which in this case could be none other than the kingdom of Rondon. Now, you may ask, what exactly does all of this have to do with Pocketcat, with the disappearance of the children, and with his mysterious appearance in the dungeon? The detail of a plague caused here by insects and rats is especially noteworthy because it evokes many parallels with the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story that, in my view, may be directly connected to the disappearance of the children, as well as to Pocketcat's appearance in the Dungeon of Fear and Hunger. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is set in the city of Hamelin, which one day becomes overrun by rats, plunging the townspeople into misery. At that very moment, a strange man appears. He is strikingly dressed, speaks politely, and promises to solve the problem if he is paid properly. That man uses the sound of his pipe to enchant the rats, leading them out of the city and saving Hamelin from disaster. But when the townspeople break their word, he returns. And this time, what he enchants and leads away is no longer the rats, but Hamelin's own children. The price that community has to pay is not money, but its very future. That sounds familiar, right? Placed in the context of Rondon, with disease spreading through rats and vermin, and with children disappearing, the similarity between Pocketcat and the Pied Piper of Hamelin is far too obvious to ignore. Both are strangers with a polite appearance. Both are directly tied to the disappearance of children. And more importantly, neither enters the community in the form of a monster from the outset, but first appears beneath a disguise, before its true nature reveals itself in its proper shape. It cannot be stated with absolute certainty how Pocketcat abducted the children, or what each step looked like. But in my view, if the Pied Piper lured children away with music, then Pocketcat most likely uses a different form of enchantment: words, temptation, gifts, and the aura that is always half polite, half distorted. It also cannot be ruled out that he infiltrated the kingdom by offering to deal with the vermin problem in the city. After all, he bears the form of a cat, and a cat dealing with rats does sound plausible, though even I find this argument somewhat strained and a little humorous. Well, anyway, one way or another, Pocketcat managed to infiltrate the community, and as someone who could solve a problem, he gradually lured his prey, the children, to a secluded place and devoured them there, and the dungeon of fear and hunger was the perfect place to carry out these dark acts. Think about it. The appearance of a polite merchant in a cat mask, speaking in a playful manner and always maintaining the bearing of a gentleman in a dark dungeon overflowing with horrifying murderers sounds very strange, doesn't it? Perhaps after the series of child disappearances, the kingdom began to take notice of Pocketcat, and he appears here both to hide and to continue his perverse acts. By its very nature, the dungeon is an ideal place for Pocketcat to dwell. It is a space where every moral standard is distorted, where the mind of anyone who remains too long is eventually eroded by darkness. Pocketcat alone seems unaffected by the dungeon's darkness. That is not too difficult to understand. After all, he is a creation of a god. Not only that, he himself once implied that he was born from tragedy and darkness. Pocketcat is already far too familiar with the darkness that always weighs within him, and can even draw energy from it without depending on anyone. Perhaps, for humans, the dungeon is a place where the mind is worn down little by little. But in Pocketcat's case, it may instead be the ideal environment. Not only because he can resist the erosion of darkness, but also because that immoral space allows him to carry out his most disgusting acts in a form that has already been normalized.
Well, anyways, I'm a merchant of sorts. I sell precious items and weapons for those in need. The funny thing is, though, I don't want your gold or silver. I will trade items for human children. Bring them to me and I'll make it worth your while. My pockets are very deep, you see.
By seeing himself as a merchant, Pocketcat takes the most civilized structure of humanity itself and twists it into the most depraved thing imaginable, turning children into a unit of currency. By trading, buying, selling, and eating children in the dungeon, he can both obtain prey without having to act directly with his own hands and hide in the darkness, patiently waiting for the true prey in this hunt to appear.
Well, hello, little one. What a pretty little face you are. I like your hips and ankles especially. How about I make an offer you cannot refuse? Just for you, my special customer. I will trade the little girl to an item of your choosing.
The girl is a mysterious being who carries within herself a seed and who also serves as the vessel for the godhood of the god of the depths. Nilvan, the Endless One, her mother, arranged an elaborate plan in the hope of turning her daughter into an ascended god, one who would guide humanity and open a new age, an age no longer dependent on or influenced by the old gods. At an unspecified point, Nilvan arranged to bring her daughter into the dungeon, partly to carry out the plan of ascension. The rest was to avoid the watchful gaze of the moon god, as well as interference from the other gods, if any. That plan seemed perfect, except there's one issue. Nilvan had underestimated the power of the all-seeing one in the sky. Somehow, the moon god discovered this plot. In response, he sent Pocketcat and the Lady of Moon, another of his creations alongside Pocketcat, to the dungeon with a single task: to pursue, seek out, and eliminate that seed of potential before it could take root and grow. From the very first encounter, Pocketcat seems to have recognized his prey almost immediately. This demonstrates that he possesses an extremely keen intuition, or some ability that allows him to see through others. The greeting he gives the girl is at once bizarre, disgusting, and revealing of a perverse interest he makes no effort to conceal. There is something about the girl that makes Pocketcat especially desperate to possess her, far beyond the simple task of pursuing and destroying her. And that is what makes me curious. Before we can answer this question, we need to look at the girl, more precisely at what is hidden deep within her body, the Ancient One soul. This is one of the most unique souls in the Fear and Hunger universe, an ancient, singular soul that carries almost limitless potential. If Pocketcat truly possesses the ability to see through others, then it cannot be ruled out that he also recognized the ancient soul hidden deep within the girl's body. And that soul is what Pocketcat truly craves. This leads us further to another conclusion. Pocketcat not only hunts special children in order to devour them, he also consumes the unique souls they possess. The purpose of this act remains shrouded in mystery. It may be that devouring the souls of his victims is a way to increase his own power, or to maintain the state of his current body by using other souls to fill the special soul he himself possesses. A mystery I will explain more fully in the final part of the video. So, if the argument above is correct, then in Pocketcat's eyes, the girl is a special reward, a rare joy that, as he himself once admitted, someone like him, whose entire life has sunk into darkness and tragedy, can seldom have. Across the whole crisis of 1590, Pocketcat appears a total of 3 times. The first is beside the wooden barrels in the cave. The second is at Cave Dweller Village. And the last is before the Golden Temple, where he makes one final offer to trade for the girl if we refused him the previous times. It is here that, depending on our decision, the girl's fate branches into completely different directions. If we accept the exchange, Pocketcat becomes so delighted that he can barely conceal his excitement. He giggles, leaves behind a farewell, then disappears together with the girl, whose face is marked by absolute terror. We cannot say this with certainty, but based on what we have analyzed about Pocketcat, it is very likely that the girl's fate would be no different from that of the other children who disappeared from Rondon, perhaps even more tragic. By contrast, if we refuse, we witness another face of Pocketcat. No longer the polite and humorous merchant, he loses his composure, snarling like a beast that has just had the prey right before its eyes taken away.
No. You see, a large chap like myself asking nicely for a small little offering, something so insignificant. You barely even know this little creature. You just met her a few fleeting moments ago. Yet you decline me this tiny pleasure? My only pleasure.
This is perhaps the first time, and also the only time, that we see Pocketcat behave in a manner completely different from his usual bearing. That alone is enough to show just how great his interest in the girl truly is. having the gift taken away, along with the small pleasure he yearns for, causes Pocketcat's true nature to reveal itself. Well, this reaction is actually not all that surprising. From our very first meeting, we already knew that this merchant always wore a mask. Not only the cat mask on his face, but also the mask in the way he speaks, the way he laughs, and the role of the gentleman he persistently performs. Like humanity, the moment his personal interests are touched, the artificial mask he painstakingly built is stripped away almost at once. It could be said that the moon god succeeded in creating a demon that bears all of humanity's ugliness and artificiality. Even after accidentally revealing his true nature, Pocketcat still does not stop performing his profoundly artificial act.
You don't always get what you want, huh? I did think you loved me. I really did. I mean, how else do you explain all those long gazes we shared, and how we always used to talk to the long hours of the night? Just the two of us. Maybe our feet gently touched each other when no one else was watching. I thought there was something there. I'm not going to lie. This breaks my heart. I think it's best for me to go. Just leave this place. If you ever... No. Some things are better left unsaid. I'll leave while I still have my dignity. Goodbye.
Before leaving, Pocketcat still gives one final monologue true to his nature. He swaps the terms of the situation, turning our refusal to trade the girl into a romantic tragedy, as though we were the ones betraying a relationship that had never existed. To be honest, this is the only moment that made me feel both amused and somewhat sympathetic toward him. And this is bad. Very bad indeed. Because unconsciously, I too had been charmed by this mysterious merchant, drawn in to the point of developing a kind of sympathy that should never be felt for a monster. One thing that has always made me wonder is this. Despite desiring to possess the girl so intensely, Pocketcat never tries to take her by force. Given his nature, that is truly very strange. One possible hypothesis is that, through his abilities, Pocketcat may have realized that our strength had reached a level he could not easily challenge. Or perhaps, in my view more likely, Pocketcat is bound by some kind of tether imposed by his master. It allows him to trade, tempt, and apply pressure through words, but does not allow him to intervene on his own and break the entire game, if doing so runs contrary to the path laid out by the older god. This brings us to the next question. What exactly is the path laid out by the older god? The new gods once stated, Pocketcat's motivations lie in the path laid out by the older god. If understood in this sense, then the scope of Pocketcat's will and freedom of action seems to be controlled by the older god through a set of rules laid down in advance. Now, you might be wondering what exactly those rules are, why they were established, and why they affect Pocketcat. In a video analyzing Olmir, I proposed the hypothesis that his birth and ascension are closely tied to the older gods, specifically Grogoroth, Sylvian, and Vitruvia. Most likely, after Olmir's failure to ascend into a more perfect state, which led to the birth of the sulfur god, the ancient gods decided to abandon humanity and withdraw into the eternal realm, the void. It seems that after departing, the old gods established a rule of divine hierarchy, a covenant that not only forbade any old god from returning to the physical realm, but also prohibited them from directly intervening in events taking place in the real world, especially events that are intentionally and significantly tied to humanity's fate. That explains why, Despite hating humanity, the moon god does not act directly, but instead created Pocketcat and controls him like a chess piece to carry out his will in the real world. Even so, Pocketcat is still a creation directly tied to an old god. Because of that, he too cannot escape the subtle influence of that set of rules. It may also be that the moon god himself deliberately imposed limits on Pocketcat, preventing his creation from going too far and violating this divine code. Rare only permits Pocketcat to trade, negotiate, manipulate, and guide, and does not permit him to directly seize or intervene with brute force. Now, hold on to that idea for a moment and look at the Lady of Moon. Another creation also born from the moon god, the Lady of Moon likewise, in some strange way, does not show open hostility when confronting us. Like Pocketcat, her presence leans more toward persuasion, exchange, and negotiation, rather than openly seizing by violence. This further strengthens the hypothesis about the covenant between the old gods that we have just proposed, and at the same time gives us an answer as to why. Despite desiring to possess the girl, Pocketcat did not choose to confront us. It is not that he did not want to seize the girl, but that he could not. Overall, however this is to be understood, the final result does not change. Pocketcat failed, and that was no small failure. The girl ultimately became the god of fear and hunger, a new ascended god entering the ranks of the higher beings. Her appearance simultaneously opened a new age for humanity, an age more cruel and harsher, but also clear proof that human beings had truly touched the very thing the moon god had always feared. Even though he had failed in the very mission his master entrusted to him. But that was not yet the end of Pocketcat's story. The moon god still needed him for another plan, this time on a larger scale. A loop, a festival, a blood-soaked stage beneath the moonlight, where Pocketcat would return in the familiar role of a merchant. Only this time, the prey and the unit of currency he uses in trade would be far more horrifying than before. The setting of Fear and Hunger 2 unfolds hundreds of years after Pocketcat's failure in Part 1. The birth of the god of fear and hunger directly ushered in the cruel age, a dark, harsh, and merciless era. Under the pressure of plague, fear, and hunger, humanity was forced to change. From that point onward, the world gradually shifted toward industrialization and modernization. Cities, factories, railways, and smoke replaced the ancient dense forests one after another. Nature was devastated, and with the death of Venushka, the old god of nature, the forests that had once been ideal places for creatures like Pocketcat to lurk in were gradually reduced as well.
Things sure have changed since then, haven't they? We live in peculiar times. The world has gone through true darkness. The world has been at a standstill, in a deep rest. People stocked up on toilet paper and hid in their homes with their loved ones. They were waiting for that glimpse of light, just because they knew that even the darkness has a breaking point.
Everything seems to have grown worse as, under the influence of the god of fear and hunger, the world appears to have fallen into a dark age of stagnation, isolation because of disease, and disconnection. The world had changed. Humanity had changed. The detail of people stockpiling toilet paper and hiding at home with their loved ones may be an allusion to the COVID period in the real world, and it may also suggest that Pocketcat's hunts had become less easy, as his prey no longer dared to leave their homes because of the influence of the plague. Even so, even the longest dark night has its limit. And when humanity overcame it and stepped back outside, that was also when Pocketcat returned once again. No longer lurking in forests or dungeons, this time Pocketcat returned on a larger stage, one that allowed him to immerse himself in new hunts with new prey, the Festival of Termina. Termina is a survival festival, a battle royale, where 14 contestants are drawn to Preheval by the moon god and forced to take part and kill one another in a game lasting 3 days. Only one person is allowed to leave when the 3 days end, or else all of them will be transformed into horrific monsters beneath the light of the moon god. At first, it seems that this festival was established by the old gods and early humanity in order to honor them. But over the centuries, it became distorted. The one behind that corruption was none other than the moon god and his followers, among them Pocketcat. From a festival of reverence, Termina gradually became a death game, a mechanism of purification, a way of removing the seeds that carried the potential to grow greatly in the future. If in the year 1590, the moon god's target was focused on children who carried seeds of divinity, such as the girl, then by this stage, the scope seems to have expanded much further. Not only children, adults as well, those who had already formed a will, who already possessed the ability to shape the future, became targets to be fed into that machinery of selection. Fear and hunger, too, opens precisely as the cycle of the festival begins once again, allowing the moon god along with his followers, attendants, and creations to return. Among them, of course, is the witty merchant himself, Pocketcat.
Well, hello, stranger. Have we met yet? There is something familiar about you, so surely we have. You have one of those faces. A face one does not simply forget. You glow and lift up everyone around you. I hope you are enjoying the ball.
Whereas before, Pocketcat still concealed himself behind mystery and an odd way of speaking. This time, he almost reveals his nature completely from the very first moment we meet him. Pocketcat is caught bent over a blood-soaked sack, beating it violently, while from inside comes the shrill screaming of a child. The blood-soaked setting of the festival and the city of Preheval seems to have allowed the beast to hunt and kill without the slightest concealment. Pocketcat is truly enjoying the feast, enjoying the murderous atmosphere of the festival, enjoying his hunt. As before, Pocketcat appears in the role of a merchant who trades. But this time, instead of children, he accepts trade in something else, something more horrifying, but also more practical within the context of the festival.
I didn't mean to take your time. From what I understand, you've got your hands full with the festival already. So I'll get straight to the point. Not only a wandering gentleman, but I am also a heads salesman of sorts, with deep, deep pockets. What is a heads salesman, you ask? Well, it is exactly what it sounds. I'm willing to part from my valuable collection if the price is right. And the price is severed heads of those participating in the festival. Macabre, I know, but you get used to it.
By encouraging us to use the heads of other contestants in exchange for valuable items, Pocketcat indirectly pushes forward the progress of the festival. That reveals Pocketcat's role in the festival. A catalyst, a link that helps the Festival of Termina operate more smoothly in the most distorted direction possible. What is interesting is that, despite being a loyal servant of the moon god, the host of the festival is not Pocketcat, but Perkley, one of the contestants who had once won in the past. That sounds strange, doesn't it? If from the very beginning the moon god created the festival of Termina to eliminate humans with exceptional potential, then why would he not let Pocketcat directly oversee the entire course of events? Was Pocketcat not created from the outset precisely to serve that purpose? Why would the moon god allow a human as difficult to control as Perkley to become the coordinator, while his loyal servant, Pocketcat, a creature who possesses the ability to manipulate psychology through words and to read people with extraordinary sharpness, is left only to push and distort the ritual from the sidelines? To understand the real reason behind this, let's take a step back. Do you remember the hypothesis we proposed earlier about a divine covenant? Something that does not allow the ancient gods to directly interfere in the events taking place in the real world after they abandoned humanity? Think about it. If Pocketcat were allowed to directly act as the host of the festival, would that not mean the moon god was almost openly violating that very rule? Because of that, the moon god was forced to use another method. He corrupted Perkley and manipulated him into becoming the host, while allowing Pocketcat to occupy the role of a guide, enabling him to corrupt the festival from within without letting his own creation directly intervene.
We've got quite a pickle here. You see, my master has made it very, very, very clear that I shall not let my dirty little paws affect the course of events during the festival. But what is a gentleman duel without the adrenaline rush of an excitement? I cannot just stand here idle. Now can I, old sport? So, I came up with the most perfect solution. If you tell me what to do, I'm just following your wishes, right? So tell me, which limb would you have me remove? Do not worry. My touch is gentle, yet firm.
Everything becomes clear. The moon god truly has placed an invisible leash around Pocketcat's neck, preventing him from directly interfering in the course of the festival. But like his own crafty master, Pocketcat came up with a subtle way of bending the rules. He manipulates, provokes, and urges the other party to speak aloud the thing he wants, or to issue the command he needs. At that point, Pocketcat's role is only to follow the other person's instruction and desire, which allows him to disguise his actions beneath the guise of carrying out someone else's will and request. In that way, he can still attack the victim or interfere in the festival without truly breaking the rule that has been laid down. It must be said that the moon god was also extremely cunning in leaving behind many loopholes, allowing Pocketcat a certain degree of free will. Although he cannot directly control the festival, Pocketcat can still indirectly push its progress through negotiation, exchange, and temptation. And all of that requires precisely the thing Pocketcat is most skilled at: persuasion, manipulation, and reading the victim. Let us pause here for a moment and look toward the world of Berserk, a major source of inspiration for the world of fear and hunger. From the very beginning, Berserk has always posed a central question. Is mankind's fate controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Pocketcat truly bears many similarities to the God Hand, in that both are entities created by a higher being, while also being bound by a set of rules that comes from the very one who gave birth to them. In the case of the God Hand, rather than directly intervening in events in the physical world, they manipulate and warp the flow of fate through dreams, revelations, prophecies, and the apostles who operate in the mortal realm. Pocketcat functions according to a similar logic. Although limited by the laws of the higher being, he, together with his master's followers, can still distort and corrupt the festival through manipulation, bargains, and by guiding humanity along the path he has already prepared. Of course, the two works cannot be treated as entirely identical, but the way the God Hand and Pocketcat operate clearly shares the same essential nature. They do not directly interact with the world, but condition that world to change according to their will. There is something ironic in that. Human beings in the worlds of berserk and fear and hunger alike cannot truly control their own will and fate. Returning to the festival of Termina, this appearance of Pocketcat also reveals another interesting mystery. If we learn Mind Read, a form of moon god magic that allows one to reveal the deepest thoughts of others and then use it on Pocketcat, we receive an extremely interesting line of dialogue.
I did it! I dropped the L-bomb! What a rush!
I'd tap my back if my tapping hand wasn't so deep in my pocket. Maybe you can do it in my stead, you little eavesdropper. Or you rather dig into my pocket while I tap myself. I jest. Don't worry. We both share the same gift of eavesdropping. Let us get back to our subject.
Interesting. Indeed, deeply interesting. Pocketcat, much like the Lady of Moon, also possesses special psychic powers. One of them is the ability to communicate telepathically and read thoughts, a power that was most likely granted directly by their master, the moon god. But it does not end there. If the moon god's magic is what allows truth to be pierced through, then that also means Pocketcat can do more than merely read thoughts. He may be able to see through many other things as well. Strength, power, the deepest desires of the other person, and of course, the hidden potential within them. This power does not merely function as a kind of radar for identifying and classifying potential prey, such as the girl. It also allows Pocketcat to avoid clashes with the strong, to stand behind the scenes manipulating the contestants in the festival without directly intervening, and perhaps even beyond that, to possess one of them. Yes, you did not hear that wrong. Pocketcat truly used his power to possess one of the 14 contestants in the festival. And this is where the story becomes interesting. It all begins with a special contestant, and also the important prey Pocketcat had set his sights on from the very beginning of this hunt. Dawn. Dawn was born in the kingdom of Rondon. From the time he was a child, he had to wander across Europa with his parents. They were devout followers of Sylvian, the older god of procreation and creation. Because of that, Dawn's childhood was bound up with a warped cultist way of life that he hated from the depths of his being. In every new town, Dawn watched his parents put on rabbit masks and go out into the fields with other followers to take part in rituals. His parents cared more about religion than they did about their own child. And worse still, they tried to pass on Sylvian's healing gift to him, as if it were a blessing, while to Dawn it only further emphasized that he had never truly been loved in the proper sense from the very beginning. From a very early age, Dawn understood the truth that in the world of the gods, no gift ever appears without a price attached. It was Sylvian's blessing itself that caused his parents' mental state to gradually rot away over time. They spent longer and longer out in the fields, until one day they never returned at all. Left alone at the age of 13 in Rondon, Dawn stood before two choices, either trying to earn an honest living or falling into the path of pickpocketing and deception. Whatever decision he made, Fate ultimately pushed Don toward the same turning point when he met Baron von Dutch. Dutch took Don in at his estate. There, he was taught manners, the way to speak, the way to walk, and the way to live as part of the upper nobility, to appreciate refined things such as art, etiquette, bearing, and even self-respect as expressed through outward form. That is why Don carries himself with a manner so distinct, polite, and restrained in a way unlike children who grew up amid the streets and violence. During his time at the Baron's estate, he gradually grew close to Elise, the Baron's daughter. Elise was drawn to the warped stories of Don's childhood, to the madness that his cultist upbringing had left behind. And Don, after a childhood deprived of care and an unstable adolescence, felt for the first time that he was truly being seen as a human being. Meanwhile, Baron showed particular interest in Don's knowledge of Sylvian and the healing ability he had inherited. An exchange took shape. Don offered what he knew of Sylvian, and the Baron, who had once been a doctor, would teach him modern medicine. When they grew older, Don and Elise became lovers, and even received the Baron's blessing, despite the fact that Don's origins were in no way noble. His love for Elise was one of the rare joys he was able to feel in the course of his dark life. And for one brief moment, Don felt for the first time as though his life was finally moving in the right direction, until the true chain of tragedies began. Conflict between the Eastern Union and the Bremen Empire broke out, dragging many neighboring countries into war. The Kingdom of Rondon was no exception. The kingdom conscripted every capable man to the front lines, and Don, too, was swept into that war. Witnessing the horrors of war, the only thing that kept Don sane was the thought of the new family waiting for him back home. Every night, he would read Elise's letters and fall asleep beside her photograph, until one day, those letters stopped. Sensing that some terrible omen was descending, when Rondon withdrew from the war, he rushed straight home as fast as he could, only to realize, cruelly, that what awaited him at the Von Dutch estate was not reunion, but the most horrific tragedy of his life. The great house was now dark and deathly still. Don searched from room to room without seeing a single person, until he noticed the cellar door standing partly open. Behind it was a horrifying scene enough to shatter anyone's mind. A strange ritual circle, and at its center, the standing corpse of Baron. He seemed to have died where he stood from cuts and injuries that may have been self-inflicted. Scattered around the cellar were sacrificial body parts offered to a god Don had never heard of. Don's heart nearly broke in the moment he realized who those body parts sacrificed in that mad ritual belonged to: his wife, Elise. There is no pain more terrible than witnessing the death of the person one loves with one's own eyes. In the depths of absolute despair, Don tried every possible way to save Elise. He tried methods that cannot be named for many days. He even attempted to exchange a part of his own life in return for Elise's. But all of it was futile. Elise's soul had gone too far to be brought back, and Don lost one of his eyes. The Baron had been completely consumed while practicing the occult in Don's absence. All that remained were documents and a vague clue, a name repeated many times in the Baron's papers: Prehevel. Understanding that this place was connected to the Baron's mysterious ritual, and perhaps also the only place that could lend some meaning to this entire madness, Don set out for Prehevel, a place that concealed clues about his wife's death, and at the same time, the thread that held the fragile hope allowing him to preserve the last of his will to live. Looking back across Don's entire life before the festival of Termina, it becomes clear that he was a human being hollowed out almost completely. His childhood was destroyed, his family shattered. War crushed his humanity. The love of his life being taken from him burned away his soul almost entirely. Don's whole life was nearly submerged in the mire of darkness and tragedy. And by coincidence, it is exactly like the way Pocketcat once alluded to himself. Born from darkness, living in darkness, and knowing only brief pleasures before sinking once again into the tragedy of darkness, an existence that can never reach happiness. That startling similarity is what brought Don into Pocketcat's sights, not only as prey, but as a perfect host.
Monsters are real. Ghosts are too. They live inside of us, and sometimes they win.
In one branch of the timeline, where the festival of Termina reaches its full course, if Don remains alive until the third day, his body will ultimately be transformed under the influence of Moonscorch. Moonscorch, which may also be called moonlight cancer, is a state in which both body and mind are transformed when a human or creature is burned too deeply by the light of the moon god. In the context of the festival of Termina, Moonscorch functions as a punishment for those who do not participate in the festival, or do not eliminate enough other contestants within the 3-day limit imposed by the festival. The most terrifying thing about Moonscorch is that it does not turn people into monsters at random. The moon-scorched form usually reflects the deepest part of their nature itself. Trauma, fear, desire, insecurity, or inner conflicts repressed for too long. In other words, Moonscorch is the phenomenon in which the moon god's moonlight roasts both body and soul, forcing the most distorted part within a human being to rise to the surface and crystallize into a monstrous shape. This is where our story reaches its turning point. Don's transformation is not described in the ordinary way given to the other contestants. Before that fateful moment, Pocketcat appears and begins his favorite game of manipulation.
Once again, you find yourself in the familiar pit of despair. You've tried to claw yourself up from this miserable hole time and time again. It's time to accept the inevitable. Maybe this was your home all along. You were meant to fall here all those times. Because let's face it, you never felt quite right when you were among those smiling crowds, did you? You always felt like an outsider, like you were just a bystander, spectating what life looked like in the sun. Like using a mask, you hid in the darkness, but you fooled no one. Everyone saw right through it. They knew your true alignment and your past, and you liked it like that. You liked feeling different. You realize it now, don't you? There never was a mask. It was all you, baby. The pointy ears, the fangs, the wide eyes. That is who you are. A dirty, degenerate furry. Now take the mask and this jacket. Ramble on, my friend, old sport. It's your time to bask in the sun.
Don transformed into Pocketcat. More precisely, Don had his mind manipulated into becoming Pocketcat. Pocketcat broke a mind that was already fragile, then persuaded Don to put on the mask and coat of his own accord. accepting life under a new identity. It seems that Dawn was a successor prepared in advance, and this is further reinforced by the many clues suggesting that Dawn had been watched by Pocketcat even before he set foot in Prehevel. That means this plan of possession did not begin on the third day of the festival. The third day was only the moment it was completed, when the light of the moon god burned away the last fragment of reason remaining in the victim, allowing Pocketcat to invade, manipulate, and fully possess the host. So, perhaps all this time, we have understood the true origin of this creature entirely wrong. Pocketcat is not wholly an entity born complete from Rare's dream from the very beginning. He is an entity capable of changing hosts by possessing fragile and vulnerable human beings. One half of him originates from humanity. More precisely, he is a hybrid being between a human who has completely collapsed mentally and a creation of the moon god. This revelation also gives us the answer to how such a creature can exist in the real world. In essence, Pocketcat is like a mask that parasitizes chosen hosts. With the aid of his master's light, that mask appears, clings tightly to the host's face, assimilates with that person's tragedy, darkness, and despair, then merges all of it together to create a bizarre creature. The body remains human, but the face is fused with a cat mask so tightly to the flesh that it can no longer be separated. A kind of assimilation of being. In truth, if one looks more carefully, this secret had already been partly revealed from the first time we met Pocketcat, in Fear and Hunger 2, when he says something very strange, that it seems he has met us in a past life of some kind. This may be a way of implying that he once met us, the players themselves, during the events of the first game. Or perhaps he is implying that in the past, his current host once knew the character we are controlling. However one understands it, it leads us to one conclusion. Pocketcat does not completely assimilate the host. Some aspect of the personality and memory remains, but in a fully distorted form. This explains how he can continue to exist across many centuries, and why, after each appearance, he undergoes certain changes in appearance, bearing, and the layers of knowledge he possesses. This point is reinforced further when Pocketcat appears at the museum and expresses many deep perspectives on art after possessing Dawn, a man who, as we know, was taught art and the bearing of the upper class during the time he lived at the Baron's estate. One thing that makes me wondering, what standard caused Pocketcat to choose Dawn as his new host? We know that Dawn's entire life was submerged in darkness and tragedy, but that alone was likely still not enough. There must have been something in Dawn that made him more special than all the others who also bore painful fates. Beyond being one of the 14 contestants chosen to take part in the festival, which means that Dawn is one of the humans with immense future potential, Dawn also carries within himself something special, the blank soul. In the world of fear and hunger, there exists an entire system of souls divided into many different types. They are determined from the moment a person is born, and they also indicate how that person's personality and life trajectory will develop. Among them, the blank soul is a special type of soul. Blank soul can be understood as an empty soul, one lacking the anchor point of the self. It is not that Dawn has no personality. Rather, the core that keeps that human being standing has been eroded to the point that it is almost no longer intact, and that is precisely why the blank soul becomes something so dangerous. A soul like that can very easily become a place for something else to anchor itself. fill the void and take possession. In this case, that thing is Pocketcat. Pocketcat's choice of Dawn as a host was not random at all. It was the result of a very specific process of selection based on 3 factors. First, from birth, the host must carry a tragic fate, a life worn away by darkness and suffering. Second, the host's body and self must contain strong capability and potential. And third, the most important factor of all, that host must possess a blank slate, the very thing that allows Pocketcat to take root, anchor himself, and then gradually corrupt and possess the host's entire soul. This is also demonstrated very clearly after we defeat Dawn in the form of Pocketcat. At that point, the mask seems to have merged with Dawn's face and cannot be torn off no matter how hard one tries. More than that, if necromancy is used on his corpse, the spell also fails, because Dawn's soul by then has become too corrupt and too frail to be called back into the body. There was no longer any way to save Dawn. Not only had his identity been erased by the mask, but even his soul had been almost completely ruined by Pocketcat. The story of Dawn and Pocketcat is the clearest proof of the line. All it takes is one bad day to reduce the sanest man alive to lunacy. That only a single push is enough to make a person who has already been hollowed out collapse. And when darkness and madness have completely covered over reason, they will choose to put on a mask behind whose polite kindness and courteous smile there may be hidden a bloodthirsty, deranged monster.
Who of us doesn't cover their true face and hide behind a persona? In the broad daylight, we adopt a social role depending on the surrounding people. We put on a mask that works as the public image of our true personality. Do we hide our face to avoid the judgment of the people, or do we look down in shame as the sun watches our every move? A sun that knows our deepest longings and lustful thoughts. Only in the darkness of the night does the true and vile nature of men get revealed. We share our decrepit bodies only to the select few under the moonlight. Despite what lowly thieves covering in the shadows would like you to think, the moonlight hides no one.